All right, Shabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul. Sherry and Sarah Wolaski for dedicating all the Sherman Shashos this month in the Schus of Rafu Shlema for Zechariah Dov Ben Perel Shira, and to thank the Tilson and Wolf families from Eretz Yisrael for dedicating all of the Shiurim and Drushos this month. Baruch Hashem, in honor of our children who were Zocha to get married. Baruch Hashem, wishing everyone a Mazel Tov and a Shana Tova. Our week of learning sponsors, Nancy and David Berkowitz, in celebration of their son Jonathan's recent engagement, Rachel Harris. Mazel Tov to the new couple, and they should be Zocha and Meretz Hashem to build the Bayis Naman B'Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. Baruch Hashem, a lot to do today. Today's daf is Daf Yud 10. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Tes Samad Beis. I believe we left off 12 lines up from the bottom. For Rabbi Yochanan, Hai Uba'Allah, my Avidle. Suppose if you remember again, the last sugya, we did actually a lot in yesterday's daf, but the last sugya that we saw in yesterday's daf was the sugya of Kiddushin Bebiyah, the ability to go ahead and effect Kiddushin through marital relations. So there we had, so again, everyone is agreeing it works. The machlokes ultimately is, what's the source? So we had Rabbi Yochanan saying the pasuk was Be'ulas Baal, and we had Rabbi Zera explaining that ultimately, again, the pasuk was, or the phrase was, Uba'Allah. Uba'Allah. So we spent yesterday going back and forth trying to understand the need for both of these psukim, for each of these derivations. Then the Gemara today discusses as follows. Rabbi Yochanan, Hayu Ba'Allah, my Avidle. What does Rabbi Yochanan do with the pasuk of Uba'Allah? What does he do with it? So the Gemara says, Hahu mibayile zu niknis bebiyah, vein amayvir niknis bebiyah. Ultimately, this teaches us that Allah Lamaisa, this woman, in other words, a wife, is acquired with biyah, but ultimately an ama ivriya is not. Sagadait chamina, I would have thought, tisi v'kavachomer mi yavama. Bring a kavachomer from yavama. What's the kavachomer? Uma yavama she niknis bekesef niknis bebiyah, a yavama who is not acquired with biyah. I'm sorry, a yavam is not acquired with kesef, is acquired with biyah. Zu sheniknis bekesef, eno din sheniknis bebiyah. Then certainly the ama ivriya, who is acquired with kesef, certainly should be acquired with biyah. To which the Gemara says it doesn't work. I'll tell you why. Ma'ali yavama shekin zekuka va'omedes. It's different. A yavam, remember again, is zekuka. People say, what does zekuka mean? Zekuka means there's a zega. Ultimately, there's already a quasi-marital connection that exists because of the relationship, ultimately, again, with the deceased husband. So, because remember, also this goes back to the yesod of Yibum. What is Yibum? When Reuven is married to Rachel and Reuven dies without children, and now Rachel marries Shimon, the surviving brother, is a form of Yibum. Remember, how do we view that Yibum marriage? It is in reality an extension of that previous marriage to Reuven. So it's different. Perhaps it's only a marriage like that halacha l'maisa could be fully affected by since it says since Rabbi said the pasuk by Amma Ivriya speaks about that if the master ends up marrying the Amma Ivriya, the Jewish maidservant, and then ends up taking another wife as well, he must treat the Amma Ivriya as well as he treats any other woman whom he marries. So Ikisha Kosav Lacheres. Torah goes ahead and compares her to another wife, Ma'acheres Mekanya Mabiyah, just like another wife could be acquired with Biyah. Af Amma Ivriya Mekanya Mabiyah. Ultimately, an Amma Ivriya could also be acquired with Biyah as well. Kamash Malon, she's not. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan uses the phrase Uba'Allah to teach me that Biyah is only a mechanism to affect normative marriage, will not affect the acquisition of an Amma Ivriya. Good. V'reish Lakish, Rebbe Hai Svar Minale. From where does Rebbe know that an Amma Ivriya is not acquired with Biyah? So we're going to say, Imkim Lichtov Rachmana Uba'al. Torah could have just said Uba'al. My Uba'Allah. What is Was it on before? Oh. Okay. Vatanya, but we learned, so the Gemara is Vatanya, Bo ala yud anoshim, va'adayin hi besula. If at the end of the day, halacha l'maisa, there were 10 men had relations with a woman, but she's still a basula. So we'll say we had this in yesterday's daf. So remember again, what's that case? That's the case of Bishalo Kidarka. So 10 men had relations with a woman, but she's still a basula. So kulam beskilba. So remember again, just to orient ourselves with this case. The halacha is that normally, when a man has, when a person commits adultery, when a person commits adultery, sometimes it just gets knocked out of the. It's skila. It's skila. So here's the case. So if you have a nara ha'ma'urasa, so 10 men, 10 men committed adultery with her, but she is still a besula, i.e. was bir shelo kidarka, so kulam beskila. Everyone ultimately again is punishable by skila. Rabbi Omer, because she's still besula. Rabbi says, Omer ani, harisha beskila v'kulam mechanek. Rabbi says, no. In fact, again, I believe the first one is punishable by skila, and the rest of them with chanek. The rest of them with strangulation. Because Rabbi holds that what? The first one has relations with her, is having relations with the basula. But after him, she is a ba'ula, even though what? It was bia shelo kidarka. So you see from here that Rabbi holds that bia shelo kidarka makes a woman a ba'ula, i.e. a non-basula. She's no longer a virgin, she's not a basula, even though it's not relations with her husband. Top of Yud, Rabbi Zera, Moda Rabbi Le'iyan Knas, the Kulu Mishami. So no, Rabbi will hold like this. Rabbi will hold that halacha l'maisa, all of the men have to pay a knas, a penalty payment. In other words, we'll say, so this is actually very interesting. So remember, in addition to the death penalty that happens ultimately again with Nara HaMurasa, there is also a knas. There's a knas ultimately for violating a besula. So Rebbe holds that halacha l'maisa, all of these men have to pay the penalty payment as if they violated a besula. The kula b'shalmi. So ma'ishna miktala. So I don't understand. Rebbe Silber say top of Yud 10a, the second line down. Rebbe seems to be really playing this both ways. And on one hand, what he's saying is that halacha l'maisa, after the first guy, she's considered to be a ba'ula already, okay? Which means that everyone after the first guy is going to be punished ultimately through chenek and not through skila. Yet, he makes them all liable for the knas, for the penalty payment of violating a basula. So it doesn't make sense. To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. Shiny hasam, da'amarkra umeis ha'ish asher shachav ima livado. So Rabbi will say, ultimately, again, Rabbi will say, here's the issue. The issue is when the Torah frames the death penalty for Nara HaMurasa, the Torah indicates to us that halacha l'maisa, who will be put to death? The man who slept with her, he by himself will be put to death. So the fact that the Torah used the lashon of livado means that there could only be one man put to death by skila for relations with a Nara HaMurasa. Who's the only man? The first guy. So when it comes to the actual death penalty of skila, it's only going to be one guy. I'm both saying the rest of them get chenek. I just want to be clear. Everyone gets the death penalty in this case, right? Just the first one gets skila, the rest of them get chenek. When it comes to knas, however, the penalty payment, Rebbe holds that ultimately the penalty payment devolves upon all of the men who engaged in this act of adultery with her. Okay, incredible. For Rabbanan, hay levado my avdile. What did the Rabbanan do with this phrase levado? Because we also remember again, the Rabbanan hold that halacha l'maisa, all of them get skila. So what do they do with levado? Ultimately, again, they need it for the following. Mesu gam shnehem. Pasuk says they will both be put to death. So ultimately, again, that the death penalty is only conferred upon both of them. That when both of them are shaven, when both of them are the same. But what does it mean both the same? Look at Rashi. Shneim shaven b'nei on shelim ute gadol haba al kitana. So this is actually interesting. The only time that the death penalty is conferred upon them is when they are both the same. In other words, when they are both of the age of liability. As opposed to if the man was a gadol and the woman was or the girl was a kitana, there would not be a death penalty in such a situation like that. Okay. Rabbi Yonasan Omer, Omei Sa'ish Asher Shachav Ima Levado. Rabbi Yonasan says, on the other hand, no, that halacha l'maisa not true, even if the man was a gadol and the girl was a kitana, but she was betrothed, halacha l'maisa, he would still be put to death for that. And that's what we learn out from levado. Only if he himself, or even if he himself, is reached the age of liability, and she has not reached the age of liability, he would still be put to death. Incredible. Rabbi Yochanan, Hai Svara Minale. From where does Rabbi Yochanan know this Svara? So we'll say, so again, going back for just a second, where does Rabbi Yochanan know that the husband, has the ability to make his wife a Ba'ula, even with Bia Shalo Kidarka? From where does he learn that concept? To which the Gemara says, Imkain Nichtov Kra Bu'ulas Ish. Torah could have just said Bu'ulas Ish. My Bu'ulas Bal. What does it mean Bu'ulas Bal? Shma Mina Tarti. Shabbos said it teaches me two things. Shabbos said, Rabbi Yochanan, Bu'ulas Bal teaches me two things. Number one, it teaches me that Kiddushin can be affected through Bia. And number two, it teaches me that Halacha L'maisa, a husband makes his wife a ba'ula with bia shelo kidarga. So say so two different things. Incredible. Says the Gemara, Bailahu. So say so therefore, just to kind of close this out for just a moment, what we see over here is everyone is agreeing that Allah Chalamaisa bia affects Kiddushin. The machlokes, where do you learn it out from? Where is it from? Is it from Kikach Ish Isha Uba Allah, a man will marry a woman and have relations with her, or is it from the phrase Bu'ulas Baal? And I will say what we just did, this process over the end of yesterday's daf, beginning of today's daf, is just to try to figure out what each side does with the other's pasuk. Beautiful. Now we come to a fascinating, and you saw this big idea. So tchilas bia kona osov. Actually, this is interesting, but not actually. Tchilas bia kona osov bia kona. We're actually going to talk about this in greater depth. In the act of bia, there's different stages. So the Gemara says when we say that bia affects kiddushin, so which stage of bia are we talking about? Is it tchilas bia? Or is it sof bia, what we call the beginning of bia? Or is it the end of bia? And I will say, these stages themselves are subject to machlokes exactly what they are. So I will say, let's assume for a moment, for our purposes this morning, even though again, we're going to do this, so get a bit more in depth, but for our purposes, that tchilas bia just means contact, physical contact between the male and female sexual organs. Whereas sof bia means penetration. We're going to see about say it could be different. It could be that tchilas bia could actually mean penetration, whereas sof bia could actually mean actual like completion of the act. But again, for our purposes today, let's just go with initial contact versus penetration. So the Gemara says, nafkamina, where does this matter? Where could this be nafkamina? This is actually interesting. Kagon sheharaba upashta yada v'kibla kiddushin me'acher. So it's an interesting case, right? The case could be where maybe there was tchilas bia, the beginning of bia, but then she accepted kiddushin from someone else. Hopefully not at the same time, right? But lamaisa against lamaisa. So I'll say so. Now there was tchilas bia, and then she accepted kiddushin from someone else. Inami the kohen gadol. So this is actually very interesting. The other possibility is, What about a Kohen Gadol who's being Mekadesh? So again, she had Tchilas Bia, but she accepted Kiddushin from someone else. So if you say that Tchilas Bia affects Kiddushin, then the second Kiddushin is irrelevant. If you hold that it's Sof Bia, that's Kona, then what? Then ultimately, again, then the second Kiddushin will be valid. Other possibility, Inami, L'Kohen Gadol. L'Kohen Gadol, ultimately, Dikakani Besula Babia. But the second possibility is by a Kohen Gadol who ultimately, again, is acquiring someone with Bia. So remember again, a Kohen Gadol has to marry a Besula. Right, has to marry Besula. So Rabbi says something very interesting. So what happens if a Kohen Gadol is Mekadesh a woman through Bia? So if you say that Tchilas Bia is Kona, then fine, no problem. If you say Sof Bia is Kona, so Rabbi says something very interesting happens over here, which is that by the time Kiddushin is affected, the woman is no longer a Besula, which means that the Kohen Gadol wouldn't be able to marry. Rabbi, so hear this fascinating idea. So again, a Kohen Gadol has to marry a Besula. If you hold Tchilas Bia Kona, that the beginning of Bia affects Kiddushin, then fine. Then he's being Mekadesh a Besula. If you hold that Sof Bia Kona, that means that by the time the act is, so to speak, completed, she's no longer a Besula. Right? Because also remember again, by the time the act is completed already, penetration has occurred, in which case she's no longer a Besula, in which case he's no longer allowed to marry her. So that'd be nafkamina. So my Amar Ameir Mishnei de Rava, call a boil, daito al gmar bia. So I'll say, so again, Ameir said the name of Rava, any time that the man is affecting Kiddushin through Bia, his das, his intention is for the completion of the act. Now I'll say, so once again, we're assuming now that completion means penetration, but halacha l'maisa, so we'll see that this is actually subject to some of the, so we're actually going to see that even contemporarily, this could actually have dramatic halachic repercussions. Again, especially sometimes for a new couple. Again, we'll get into this a little bit more later on when we get to the sugya. Ibaylahu. Go to Bos, let's go weiter. So now Bos say, this is a very important shayla. So Ibaylahu. Bia nisunosa o erisinosa. So Bos say, here's the interesting question. When we say that you could affect Kiddushin with Bia, so Bos say, is Bia like one-stop shopping? Like in other words, so once you do Bia, that's Kiddushin and Nisuin? Or no, Bia's Kiddushin, and you would still have to go ahead and do Nisuin after. So you're saying, remember, it's interesting how we think, like, if you think about it in the Mishnah, so that there are three ways, right? Ha'isha niknis b'shlosha drachim, right? There are three ways you can affect Kiddushin. Kasef, Shtar, and Bia. And I will say, in our minds, if you do Kasef and Shtar, right, for Kiddushin, what has to happen afterwards? Or Nisuin, whatever Nisuin is going to be, right? Nisuin. So let's say, in our minds, so Bia is often, again, especially just the way contemporarily we conduct ourselves, Bia is a culminating event. Right, it's a culminating event. So now the Gemara is asking, by the way, if a man is Mekadesh woman with Bia, does that affect both Kiddushin and Nisuin? So that now we're done, right? The marriage is done. Or does it really just affect Kiddushin, and therefore you still need a Nisuin act afterwards? Such an interesting shayla. To which the Gemara says, "Say bailu Bia nisunosa, oerisinosa nafkamina." So we'll say, what's the nafkamina to this? So first of all, it's interesting that the Gemara has to ask what's the nafkamina. The nafkamina is obvious, right? The nafkamina is what? What's the nafkamina? Dini nisuin. Right? Okay, but the Gemara says, but there are other nafkaminas as well. Liyarsha, litamela, ulahafer nedarel. So let's say some other interesting nafkaminas over here. Let's say Reuven is mekadesh Rachel with Bia, and then Rachel dies. Before, quote unquote, there's an Nisuin. Now, technically speaking, a husband only inherits his wife after Nisuin, not after Kiddushin. So does he inherit her? Or, again, same case, Reuven is married to Rachel. Reuven did Kiddushin Bebia with Rachel. Reuven's a Kohen. Now Rachel died. Could Reuven go to her Levaya? Normally, a Kohen could only become Tameh for his wife after there was Nisuin. Lahafer Nedarel. A husband only has the ability to annul his wife's vows by himself after nisuin. So iyarmit nisuin osa. So if you say that bia, when you're mekalish b'bia, bia also affects nisuin. If you say that, then yarsha, he inherits her. Mitamela, if he's a kohen, he goes to her levaya. Umefer nedar, he could annul her vows. V'yarmit erusin osa. But if you say that halacha l'maisa, all bia does, not all bia does, but bia is a mechanism for kiddushin. And therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, all it does is erusin, then eina yarsha, then ultimately he would not inherit her, ve'ena metamela, and he would not make her tamei, ve'ena mefer nedareha, and he would not annul her vows. So I will say, what is the halacha? What is the halacha? So we'll say, so this is the yisodistic shaila, this is the yisodistic shaila that we're dealing with over here. Halacha l'maisa, when we say that bia affects marriage, does it only affect kiddushin, or does it affect nisuin as well? Amar Abaye. So Abaye says, Tashma ha'av zakai bebito bekidusha bekesa b'shtar bebia. So we'll say, so now look at this brisa. So the brisa says as follows: a father is entitled, right, has rights in his daughter's kiddushin, whether that kiddushin is affected through kesef, shtar, and bia. So we'll say if it's kesef, the father has the ability to receive kesef. Now remember again, this is assuming that she is a nara and below, right? So she gets her kesef. Shtar, he's able to receive her shtar, and bia, he's able to give her over, for marriage, for bia. Furthermore, he's entitled to anything she finds. He's also entitled to her earnings, and he has the right to annul her vows. And ultimately, again, he receives her get. But I will say, if she inherits property, let's say from her mother's family, the father does not have rights in that property. Okay, that's part one of the brisa. Part two of the brisa. Nises, if she gets married, nisuin, yasser alav habal, a husband has even greater entitlements than a husband. Than a father. Because we'll say, unlike a father who doesn't have rights in the property of his daughter, ultimately a husband will have usage rights in the property of his wife. Now we'll say, why is this brisa important for us? We'll say, listen to how the brisa was structured. The brisa spoke about the idea that a father has the right to go ahead and give his daughter over in kiddushin, right? Bekesef, bishtar, ubebia. Then it says nises, if she gets married. So we'll say, if you look at the brisa, how does the brisa look at bia? The brisa looks at bia as a mechanism for kiddushin, and then talks about nisuin separately. It would appear from here that what? That halacha l'maisa, bia only affects kiddushin, does not affect nisuin. Katani nises. So it was like katani bia, the katani nises. So it sounds like what it's saying over here is there's bia, which can affect kiddushin, and then there's nises, there's nisuin. So once they see from here that when bia is used as a mechanism for kiddushin, it only affects kiddushin and not nisuin. To which the Gemara says, Ki katani nises ashara. No. When it says nises, it's referring ultimately again to everything else. Referring to kesef and shtar, but not to bia. But it's also that bia itself would affect erusin and nisuin. Amarava. So we'll say the question is still unanswered. So our overarching question is still intact, which is, when bia is used for erusin, for nisuin, does that affect only nisuin? Sorry. When bia is used for kiddushin, does it only affect kiddushin, or does it affect kiddushin and nisuin? Amar Rava, Tashma. Rava says as follows: Tashma, Bas Shalosh Shanim V'Yom Echad. When ultimately, again, if you have a girl who is 3 years old in one day, Miskadeshes Bebia. So ultimately, again, technically speaking, she can become Mikudeshes with bia. And I will say, I just want to point out, we mentioned this again already in Ksuvas, how strange, right? Not just strange, how wrong, right? Clearly, like this is, it's hard. Again, so remember, also, we also saw how Chazal clearly frowned upon this type of Kiddushin as well. But I will say, but again, there's a difference between in any time you have like a legal discussion. There's what legally could work, but sometimes what legally could work is not at all what should be done. So again, that's why we're gonna approach this. There's a phrase halacha yevesha. Halacha yevesha just means the dry halacha. Right, just the facts, devoid of any emotion, or for that matter, again, in this case, practicality. So let's just look at it as like a legal construct. So bas shalosh shana v'yom echad. So a girl is 3 years old in one day. Miskadeshes bebia, which just means that bia becomes a halachically recognized act. Past the age of 3 years old in one day, lower than that age, the bia is not recognized as a legal act. Then ba'al yavam kna. So if a yavam had relations, they're required for yibam. V'chayavin ala mishum eishes ish. And ultimately, again, if her father actually betrothed her, so relations with her with another man would be chayiv because of adultery. Umetame as ba'ala. The Amid Beis, Latame Mishkav Tachton Ke'elyon. And I will say, ultimately, again, technically speaking, I will say this is why this case also is actually interesting. If she were to become a Nida, ultimately, again, and her husband were to have relations with her, she would confer upon him Tumas Nida. So we'll say, again, as manifest by his ability to go ahead and be Mitame Mishkav Tachton Kelyon. So we'll say, Tumas Nida has an interesting chumrah to it. And it's not a chumrah, it's a function of the Tumah. And that, remember, we'll say, imagine you have a pile of cushions, and a woman who is a Nida sits on the top cushion. What's the halacha? All of the cushions ultimately below her are tmeah as well, even though she did not come in contact with them. Well, a man who has relations with a nida essentially acquires this same level of tumah. Now, I will say, now it's not exactly the same. If you take a look at the top Rashi, we're on 10b, Yudamid Beis. Take a look at the top Rashi. L'tami mishkav tachton kelyon sha'osa bo'ala moshav mishkav afilu eser matzos. So I will say, so again, the same way that a woman who is a nida ultimately confers tumah upon all of these cushions, right? 10, he's using the lashon of 10, right? 10 stacked one on top of the other. So too again, if a man has relations with a woman who is a nida, he acquires that same level of tumah. Avalolios avatuma letame adam mikelim kimishkava shal nida atzma elatame ochlun mashkin. I will say, now the difference is when the nida herself confers tumah upon the cushions, ultimately, again, they have the ability to go ahead and make other people tmeim. The husband's or the man's tumah is not that same heightened level of tumah. He can't make his cushions, so to speak, can't make people tamei, but ultimately, again, they can go ahead and make food and drink tamei. Okay, v'miseis l'kohen. We'll say back Yudam Adalef 10b, first line. V'miseis l'kohen. But if ultimately, again, she marries a kohen, Ochelas b'truma. Ultimately, again, she's permitted to eat truma. And if any one of the arayos in the Torah have relations with her, mumsin al yada, they could be put to death as a result of that act of relations. Fihi petura. But I will say she'll be petura. Why is she petura? She's a ketana. I will say if she has relations with someone who is pasul, ultimately it would invalidate her from marrying into the kuna. So I'll say once again, what do you see from here? Katani bia v'katani nises. I will say once again, the truth is we're not really so concerned with the subject matter with this price. So what are we focused on? We're focused on the categorical organization. And that the way the price is set up, Rabosai, is the price is set up ultimately, again, it's talking about bia and then talking about nisuin. Right? So Rabosai, it says bas shalosh shanim miskadeshes bebia. So right, once she's 3 years old in one day, Kiddushin can be affected with bia. And then the price says in nises, if she does nisuin, which sounds like what? Bia does not affect nisuin. That's what it sounds like. So bia can affect Kiddushin, bia doesn't affect nisuin. To which the Gemara says, no, this is what it means to say. ihani nisuin the koininu ochalas betruma. The Rebbe will say, don't read in nises as a separate category, but rather again read it as imhani nisuin the koininu. If the nisuin that was affected by the bia was to a kohen, then she can eat truma. So it's not introducing a new category of nises, but rather it's introducing a new case of nisuin to a kohen. But it's possible that ultimately bia affects Kiddushin as well as nisuin. Good. Shabbos says, let's go a little bit weiter. We're not finished yet. Good. So says the Gemara. Tashma, ukvar shalach Yochanan ben Bagbag, eitzel Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, l'Netzivin. So let's listen to this. Rabbi Yochanan ben Bagbag sent Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Netzivin. Shamati alecha, sha'ata omer, I heard that you say, Arusa bas Yisrael ocheles betruma. Right? I heard that you hold that Narusa bas Yisrael can eat truma. So let's just to illustrate what this is. Rachel is marrying Ruvain. Ruvain is a Kohen. So now Abba says, take a simple case. Ruvain gives Rachel Kesef, Hariat Mikudeshes Li Bekesef Zu. Fine. So now Erisin, they're married. So watch this. So now Yochanan ben Bagbag sent Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. Rabbi Yehuda, I heard that you say that an Arusa, who's a Bas Yisrael, is allowed to eat Truma. Shalach lo. So Rabbi Yehuda sends back, Biata, Iata Omakain, Yochanan ben Bagbag, you hold that she can't eat Truma? Muchsekani b'cha sha'ata baki b'chadrei Torah. Lijosh b'ka b'chomer iyata yodea. So it's incredible. So Rabbi Yehuda says to Yochanan ben Bagbag, I heard that you are well versed in the chadrei, in the intricacies of Torah, and you don't even know how to darshna kal b'chomer? After all, umash shivcha kinanis shein bi'asa machilasa b'truma. If a shivcha kinanis, I will say. So remember again, a man wants to acquire shivcha. He has bia with the shivcha. I will say, what does bia with the shivcha do? Right? Nothing. That does not entitle her to truma. Kaspa machilasa b'truma. Only once he gives her money, acquires her, does that entitle her to truma. Zu, a regular woman, shebi asa machilasa b'truma. Ultimately, again, where bia does entitle her to truma, eino din shekaspa machilasa b'truma, it goes without saying that kesef kiddushin, giving her money, should certainly go ahead and allow her to eat truma. So this, I just want to point out, this is Rabbi Yehuda's retort to Yochanan ben Bagbag. So Rabbi Yehuda of Netzivin, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, ultimately goes ahead and says back to Yochanan, of course an Arusa should be able to go ahead and eat Truma, because it's a Kavachomer. If an Amma Ivriya, where bia with an Amma Ivriya does not entitle her to eat Truma, but Kesef does, so a regular woman, where bia would entitle her to eat Truma, Kesef certainly does. But again, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira said, Bab ma'asa, Shari Amru Chachamim, Ein Arusa Bas Yisrael Ocheles B'Truma, Ad Shetikanes L'Chuppah. So I will say, so ultimately, again, but what can I do? What can I say? I will say, now this is Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira saying, even though I believe that an Arusa should be able to eat Truma, but what can I do? Chazal said, an Arusa doesn't eat Truma. So I have no choice. What can I do? An Arusa doesn't eat Truma until she enters into the chuppah. And I will say, now what we're focused on over here is the very interesting use of bia, right? So how is bia being used in this marital relationship? Hechi dami, iba bia sha'al yidei chuppah, the kesef sha'al yidei chuppah. So we'll say, if we're talking about bia that follows chuppah, right? Or I should say, bia sha'al yidei chuppah, right? Or bia that comes with a chuppah. In other words, if it's bias kiddushin and then a chuppah, or kesef ayidei chuppah, so b'tarvayo mecha achla. So as I said, obviously everyone agrees that if both of these mechanisms are used, then obviously the woman in question can eat truma. Bia sha'al yidei chuppah, v'kesef sha'al yidei chuppah. Is it talking about bia with chuppah and kesef? I'm sorry, bia with chuppah and kesef without chuppah? So then hacha tarti v'hacha chada. Then I will say, in one case you have two mechanisms, one case you have one. Elalav bebia shelo ayidei chuppah, the kesef shelo ayidei chuppah. Rather, I will say, in this halachic discussion, we must be talking about over here What was he talking about? That both the bia and kesef in question was without chuppah. Now watch this. I amrit bishlam nisuin osa mishum hachi pshitale da'alimale bia mikesef. So I will say, if halacha lamaisa you hold that bia by itself works to what? Affect kiddushin and nisuin, then it makes sense to say that bia should be more powerful than kesef. Ale I amrit kiddushin osa, but halacha lamaisa if all bia does osa is what? Is kiddushin, then maish nahacha de pshitale or maish nahacha de mesapkale. Then I will say if all bia does is what? Is go ahead and halacha l'maisa affect kiddushin, then why should there be any difference with kiddushin done with kesef, kiddushin done with bia? Halacha l'maisa either way she shouldn't be able to eat truma. The kesef shalai de chuppah. We're talking about a case of bia with chuppah and kesef without chuppah. So maybe you'll say, but in one case you're utilizing two mechanisms, in one case only one. Nevertheless, the kal v'chomer still works. This is what he meant to send to him. Here's the kal v'chomer. By shifcha kinanis, I will say where bia does not entitle her to eat truma, afilu ayidei chuppah. We'll say even with chuppah, right? Even if there's bia and chuppah, those are not mechanisms that entitle a shifcha kinanis to go ahead and eat truma. Kasva ma'achila sebelo chuppah. Yet Rabbi say again, kesef will work for an ama ivriya. Sorry, for a shifcha kinanis. Even right, kesef will work even without chuppah. Zu shebi asa ma'achila sebetruma ayidei chuppah. But by a regular woman, Rabbi say, where bia followed by chuppah will allow her to eat truma. Certainly money, right, kesef kiddushin, should allow her to eat truma even without chuppah. Interesting kal v'chomer. Amru chachamim ein arusa bas Yisrael locheles b'truma ad shetikanes l'chuppah mishum du'ula. Rabbi say, but again, so just want to point out, Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseir says, but what could I do? So Rabbi say, so just before we go on, so Rabbi say, so what you have over here is a fundamental machlokes. Yochanan ben Bagbag saying that an arusa cannot go ahead and eat truma during Erusin. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseir is saying yes, she can, and he bases it on a kal v'chomer. And his kal v'chomer essentially, I will say, is that by shivcha kinanis, even if you have bia with a chuppah that doesn't allow her to eat truma, yet kesef does, then for a regular woman where bia with chuppah would allow her to eat truma, certainly what? Kesef by itself should. So that is Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseir's kal v'chomer that an arusa should be able to go ahead and eat truma. But then Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseir says, but what could I do? Chazal said that an arusa cannot eat truma. Now here he says over here, mishum du'ula. Now what did Ula say before? We actually had Ula Bosa. We had Ula back on Daf Hey. Ula said, do you know why an arusa can't go ahead and eat truma? Bosa? What are we concerned about? Because an arusa is still living where? Rachel is still living in her father's home. So what we're concerned about is if Ruvain, her betrothed, gives her truma, which technically she could eat, what are we concerned about? She's going to take that truma home and feed it to her Yisrael family. So we'll say, so that's right. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Meseir is saying, I think my kal v'chomer is a compelling kal v'chomer to allow an arusa to eat truma. But what can I do? Ula, they have a concern that if she's eating truma while she's living in her father's home, she's going to come to go ahead and eat truma. Ben bagbag kabeshivcha kinanis lo shar bekinyana hachar shar bekinyana. So I will say the reason why Ben Bagbag rejects the kal v'chomer, because he feels you're not really equating the two. In other words, halacha l'maisa, once you go ahead and you give a shivcha kinanis money, they will say what happens? You're done. It's full, right? It's complete. The transaction is complete. When you give a Jewish woman money, that's kesef kiddushin. I will say it's not complete. You still need nisun. I will say now, just to contextualize everything. Why are we doing this? You're like, I just had that same question, right? Why are we doing this? Remember again, our overarching question is bia, right? What does bia do? When a man uses bia for Kiddushin, does that affect Kiddushin and Nisuin, or just Kiddushin? This is being brought up also because, interestingly enough, if you notice, how is bia being used in this context? Bia is being used in this context as Kiddush, a mechanism for Kiddushin, but does not affect Nisuin. That's how if you look at this, that's the whole reason this is being brought up. And it happens to be, now we're being introduced to a fascinating machlokes between Ben Bagbag, Rabbi Yochanan ben Bagbag, and Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. So fascinating machlokes. So we'll say, bottom line, by the way, over here, everyone is agreeing that an arusa is not going to go ahead and eat truma. The question is just going to be why. According to Rabbi Yochanan ben Bagbag, he really feels midaraisa she can't. According to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, she absolutely can. It's a din d'Rabbanan. I just want to use the last minute just to say something interesting. If you notice, by the way, in this discussion between Rabbi Yochanan, right? So Yochanan ben Bagbag sent the question to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. And he said to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, right? I heard that you allow an arusa bas Yisrael to go ahead and eat truma. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira sends back to him. Right, of course, right? I thought that you were a person. Muchsikani becha sha'ata baki bechedrei Torah lidrash b'kav v'chomer. So he sends back to him, I thought you were an expert in Torah, in Chedrei Torah, in the secret dimensions or the inner pieces of Torah, and certainly not a darshan Kal V'chomer. What does that mean? What is that exchange? So I told you something amazing. The Chafetz Chaim, listen to this. The Chafetz Chaim explained this with a mashal. Well, first it says like this. Chafetz Chaim asks, what is the proper way to learn? What is the proper way to learn? He says, Ezu derech sheyavra adam belimudo. Im yercho shlo b'kiyas b'mesechas miyuchedes, o sheyishtadel es kol hashas af kipacho shinin. Rabbosai, listen to what the Chafetz Chaim's kasha is. When learning, should a person only focus himself on one mesechta and know it really well? Or should a person perhaps learn a lot, even though he doesn't retain everything? So let's say, what's the shaila? Should I learn Daf Yomi? Or ultimately, again, maybe focus on something a bit more be'iyin. So the Chafetz Chaim answered. He said, "Sarich adam ladas kamarach b'shal Torah shal shamisparach." He says it's clear. Person has to know as much of the wide expanse of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Torah as possible. Chafetz Chaim says, see as much as you can, and he gives a mashal. He gives the mashal of a man. He says a person who only focuses himself on one mesechta and doesn't see the expanse there. He says, you know what he's like? He's like a guy who saves up all of his money for a beautiful hat. Hat is the best hat you could possibly buy, but the rest of his clothing is tattered. When you wear that nice hat, you look foolish, because at the end of the day, it stands in contrast to your tattered clothing. As opposed to, says the Chafetz Chaim, when you go ahead and you see the expanse of Torah, what does that do? That gives you a beautiful outfit. Says Rabbi Chanan Wasserman Hashem Yikom Damo. That's the pshat in that phrase. Muchsekani becha sha'ata baki bechedrei Torah lijosh b'kav v'chomer eini yodea. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira was sending back to Yochanan ben Bagbag the following idea. He says, I know you know chedrei Torah. Rabbi say, what's chedrei Torah? Specific areas of information. Rabbi say, in order to know a Kal V'chomer, what do you need? You need expansive knowledge. Because in order for a Kal V'chomer to work, there can't be a pircha. There can't be something that breaks it or undermines it. In order to know if there's a pircha, then what? You have to know the vast breadth of Torah knowledge. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira was giving a little bit of a shtach to Yochanan ben Bagbag. He says, I heard that you're proficient in certain areas, but don't you know enough of the expansiveness of Torah in order to know a Kal V'chomer as well? So I says Hashem Yikom Damo, this was the explicit raya to the fact that the Chafetz Chaim was correct. That Allah Chalamaysa, and this justifies and makes us feel a little bit better, because sometimes we learn the daf, we learn the wide expanse of Torah, and we feel a little bit frustrated that we can't go ahead and retain everything. Chafetz Chaim is on our side. The Chafetz Chaim says the best thing in your learning is to be able to see as much as possible to gain the full appreciation and panoramic view of the Ribono Shalom's incredible Torah. So I'll stop over here today. Shkoyach. Okay. You have a great day.